Tunisia, May 1943. The Afrika Korps has surrendered. 275,000 German and Italian soldiers march into captivity, and the desert is littered with abandoned equipment. An American war correspondent named Ernie Pyle, already famous for his dispatches from the front, spots something in the wreckage, a small, odd-looking vehicle with a flat nose and bucket seats. He climbs in, turns the key, and becomes one of the first foreigners to drive a Volkswagen. What Paul does not know is that he has just discovered the vehicle American soldiers will soon be trading their own jeeps to get. 2 jeeps for 1 German bucket car. That was reportedly the going rate. This is the story of a vehicle that one American evaluation dismissed as inferior in every way to the American Jeep, except in the comfort of its seating accommodations. A vehicle that American generals would eventually order confiscated because too many soldiers were stealing them. A vehicle so good that the same army that dismissed it published a complete maintenance manual, just so troops could keep their captured examples running. The Kübelwagen was not supposed to be better than anything. It was supposed to be cheap, simple, disposable. Instead, it became the trophy every American soldier wanted to bring home. Chapter 1. The trade that made no sense. The numbers do not add up, and that is precisely the point. The Willys MB Jeep had a 60-horsepower engine. The Kübelwagen had 25. The Jeep had 4-wheel drive. The German vehicle had only 2. The Jeep could tow artillery pieces weighing over half a ton. The Kübelwagen struggled with anything heavier than a machine gun. By every metric that military procurement officers cared about, the American vehicle was superior on paper. Consider the production statistics. American factories produced 640,000 Jeeps during the Second World War. German factories produced 50,435 Kübelwagens. The ratio was roughly 12-1. American industrial might dwarf to German capacity. The Jeep won the production war before it began. And yet in the field, something strange happened. American soldiers who captured Kübelwagen refused to give them up. Officers who should have known better requisitioned them for personal use. Mechanics, who had access to unlimited Jeep parts, chose instead to scrounge for German components. The phenomenon became so widespread that General George Patton himself had to issue orders addressing it. His diary records the frustration. Practically every enlisted member, he noted, had acquired German automobiles, wasting gasoline at a magnificent rate and cluttering up the road. The sequestration of these vehicles was ordered. Patton was not exaggerating. Reports from the Third Army's logistics officers documented hundreds of captured German vehicles operating without proper authorization. The medical corps was particularly notorious. Every enlisted medic, it seemed, had managed to acquire personal transportation. The roads behind the front lines were clogged with vehicles that did not appear on any official inventory. But orders rarely stopped soldiers from acquiring what they wanted. The Kübelwagen offered something the Jeep could not: comfort, fuel economy, reliability in conditions that destroyed American vehicles, and a certain undefinable quality that soldiers recognized immediately upon driving one. The Jeep was a workhorse. The Kübelwagen was something else entirely. The trading economy that emerged was never officially documented, but persists in veteran accounts and regimental histories. For trading purposes in the U.S. Army during World War II, a Kübelwagen was reportedly worth 2 Jeeps. Some accounts suggest the rate was even higher in certain units. A captured Schwimmwagen, the amphibious variant, could command 3 or 4 Jeeps. Understanding why requires going back to 1938, to a designer named Ferdinand Porsche, and to the twisted logic of building a people's car for a nation preparing for war. Chapter 2. The People's War Car. The Kübelwagen was never supposed to exist. Ferdinand Porsche had spent years designing the Volkswagen Beetle as a civilian vehicle, a car for ordinary Germans who could not afford the Mercedes and Opels that wealthy families drove. Adolf Hitler had championed the project as propaganda, proof that National Socialism could deliver prosperity to the working class. Fiat's KDF Wagons factory, later renamed Wolfsburg, was built specifically to manufacture millions of these people's cars. The numbers behind the civilian project were staggering. The factory was designed to produce 1,500,000 vehicles per year, which would have made it the largest automobile plant in the world. German workers contributed to a savings scheme, paying 5 Reichsmarks per week toward their future Volkswagen. By 1939, approximately 336,000 Germans had enrolled in the program. None of them received a car. Then came September 1939, and everything changed. The Wehrmacht needed light transport vehicles, and they needed them immediately. Germany's invasion of Poland had revealed serious deficiencies in military logistics. The army was relying on a bewildering variety of civilian automobiles pressed into service. Mercedes staff cars, Opel trucks, BMW motorcycles, Horch command vehicles. Each brand required different spare parts, different maintenance procedures, different fuel requirements. Standardization was impossible. Breakdowns were constant. Something had to change. The numbers were damning. German forces in Poland operated over 100 different vehicle types. Spare parts logistics became a nightmare. A single infantry division might require components from 20 different manufacturers. Mechanics could not be trained on every vehicle. Repair depots overflowed with machines awaiting parts that never arrived. In January 1938, even before the war began, the Wehrmacht had ordered Porsche to develop a military version of his Beetle. The project designation was Type 62. Porsche's team stripped away the curved bodywork and replaced it with flat steel panels that could be produced with minimal tooling. They raised the suspension for better ground clearance. They added 4 bucket seats, which gave the vehicle its name. Kübelwagen was short for Kübelsitzwagen, meaning bucket seat car. Soldiers shortened it to Kübelwagen, and the name stuck. The first prototypes underwent military trials in late 1939. The results were mixed. Wehrmacht officers complained about insufficient power. They worried about the rear engine layout. They questioned whether a two-wheel drive vehicle could possibly compete with purpose-built military trucks. Some advocated cancelling the project entirely. The critics had valid concerns. 25 horsepower was laughably underpowered compared to the Jeep 60. The rear engine placement meant the front wheels bore minimal weight, potentially compromising steering on difficult terrain. Two-wheel drive seemed like a fatal limitation for a military vehicle expected to follow panzer divisions through mud and snow. Then the army tested the Kübelwagen in snow, and everything changed. German military evaluation records show that the Type 62, despite having only rear-wheel drive, easily outperformed several four-wheel drive reference vehicles in winter conditions. The secret was weight. At just 725 kilograms, the Kübelwagen weighed over 300 kilograms less than the American Jeep. When it got stuck, 4 soldiers could lift it out. When it encountered deep snow, the smooth underbody allowed it to slide across the surface, like a motorized sled, rather than digging in like heavier vehicles. The weight advantage was not accidental. Porsche had obsessed over every kilogram. The flat steel body panels were thinner than standard automotive practice. The chassis was minimalist. The engine derived from the civilian Beetle was already designed for efficiency rather than power. Every component was evaluated for weight savings. The Wehrmacht was convinced. Pre-production of the improved Type 82 began in early 1940, with mass production starting in August at the massive KDF Stat factory. The workforce that built these vehicles tells a darker story that must be acknowledged. As the war continued and German labor shortages intensified, the factory increasingly relied on forced workers. By 1944, approximately 2/3 of the Wolfsburg workforce consisted of foreign workers, many of them prisoners, brought from occupied territories and concentration camps. The vehicles that American soldiers would later covet were built by hand that had no choice. Production ramped up steadily, despite Allied bombing. In 1940, factories produced roughly 600 Kübelwagens. By 1943, annual production exceeded 15,000 units. The peak came in 1944, when over 16,000 vehicles rolled off assembly lines, despite constant disruption from air raids. By the end of the war, German factories would produce 50,435 Kübelwagens. They would serve on every front, from the frozen steppes of Russia to the burning sands of North Africa, and American soldiers would discover them in every theater of the war. Chapter 3. The engineering that defied logic. The specifications tell a story of elegant compromise. The engine was an air-cooled flat 4, displacing roughly 1 liter to 1.1 liter, depending on production year. Maximum power output ranged from 23 to 25 horsepower at 3,000 revolutions per minute. Maximum torque was approximately 68 Nm at 2,000 revolutions per minute. Top speed was 80 km per hour, approximately 50 miles per hour. Fuel consumption averaged 7 liters per 100 kilometers, which translates to roughly 34 mpg. The fuel tank held 40 liters, giving a theoretical range of nearly 600 kilometers. Compare these numbers to the Willys MB Jeep. The American vehicle had a 2.2 liters, 4-cylinder engine, producing 60 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute. Top speed was approximately 105 kilometers per hour. Fuel consumption was significantly worse, averaging around 12 to 15 liters per 100 kilometers. The Jeep weighed over 1,000 kilograms, nearly 40% more than the Kübelwagen. These numbers meant nothing to the American engineers who first examined captured examples. They were looking at the wrong specifications. The Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland conducted extensive tests on captured German vehicles throughout the war. Their assessment of the Kübelwagen contradicted everything the War Department wanted to hear. The vehicle was simpler than the Jeep, easier to manufacture, easier to maintain, faster on roads, more comfortable for passengers. The only area where the Jeep clearly excelled was raw pulling power and off-road capability in extreme terrain. But the Kübelwagen's designers had anticipated this criticism. They had engineered solutions that American testers did not immediately recognize. The portal gear hubs were the first innovation. By positioning the axle lines above the wheel centers, Porsche's engineers gave the vehicle 11 inches of ground clearance, compared to the Jeep's 8.75 inches. This meant the Kübelwagen could clear obstacles that would high-center the American vehicle. Rocks, stumps, and debris that caught on the Jeep's undercarriage passed harmlessly beneath the German design. The fully independent torsion bar suspension delivered ride quality that Jeep passengers could only dream of. Each wheel could move independently, absorbing bumps and irregularities without transmitting shocks to the chassis. The Jeep used a more primitive leaf spring design that transferred every bump directly to the occupants. After hours of driving, Kübelwagen passengers remained fresh, while Jeep crews were exhausted. The limited slip differential from ZF ensured that power reached both rear wheels, even when one lost traction. This was critical for a two-wheel drive vehicle operating in marginal conditions. When one wheel spun on ice or mud, the differential directed torque to the wheel with grip. Combined with the lightweight and smooth underbody, this system delivered approximately 80% of four-wheel drive performance at significantly lower cost and complexity. The flat enclosed underbody was perhaps the cleverest feature, where the Jeep's exposed undercarriage would catch on obstacles and dig into soft ground. The Kübelwagen's smooth belly allowed it to slide forward. German engineers called this the toboggan effect. In sand, mud, and snow, the vehicle could propel itself across surfaces that would trap heavier machines. The air-cooled engine eliminated the Jeep's most vulnerable component, the radiator. A single bullet through a Jeep's cooling system could disable the vehicle. The Kübelwagen had no such weakness. The engine drew air through vents in the rear bodywork, passing it over the cylinder heads for cooling, then exhausting it through additional vents. No water, no coolant, no radiator to leak or freeze. British engineers examined a captured Kübelwagen in 1943. Their official report dismissed it as exhibiting no special brilliance, not worth copying by British industry. Yet the same report acknowledged that the vehicle delivered approximately 80% of four-wheel drive performance, with significantly lower mechanical complexity. The numbers reveal the contradiction. The Kübelwagen had half the horsepower of a Jeep, 1/4 fewer driven wheels, roughly 60% of the weight, and soldiers who drove both vehicles kept choosing the German one. The maintenance requirements told an even more compelling story. The Jeep required regular coolant checks, radiator inspections, and antifreeze changes for winter operation. The Kübelwagen required none of these. The Jeep's water pump could fail, its thermostat could stick, its radiator could develop leaks. The Kübelwagen had no such vulnerabilities. The air-cooled engine was deliberately simplified. Fewer moving parts meant fewer potential failure points. A trained mechanic could service the Kübelwagen significantly faster than an equivalent Jeep simply because there was less to inspect and maintain. In a war where mechanics were perpetually overworked and vehicles constantly needed attention, this simplicity mattered. Chapter 4. The Desert and the Frost. If you are finding this documentary interesting, a quick subscribe to WWII Dark Legacy helps more than you know. Now, let us examine what happened when these vehicles met actual combat. The Afrika Korps proved what German engineers had suspected, but could not guarantee. North Africa was a proving ground unlike any other. Daytime temperatures exceeded 50 degrees Celsius. Nighttime temperatures plunged below freezing. Sand infiltrated every mechanical component. Water was so scarce that vehicles with leaking radiators were effectively destroyed. The British 8th Army lost hundreds of trucks to overheating alone. The numbers from the Desert Campaign tell a story of mechanical attrition. Overheating was a constant problem for water-cooled engines. British forces lost vehicles by the hundred simply because radiators boiled dry or sprang leaks in the punishing conditions. German forces operating the same distances from supply depots in the same brutal conditions reported significantly fewer heat-related mechanical failures. The Kübelwagen thrived where other vehicles died. The air-cooled engine required no radiator, no coolant, no water. Sand that would clog a water-cooled engine's cooling passages simply blew through the Kübelwagen's ventilation system. The sealed underbody protected critical components from the abrasive desert sand, and the low fuel consumption meant vehicles could range further from supply depots, a crucial advantage in a theater where logistics determined victory. Field Marshal Owen RML relied on Kübelwagen for reconnaissance and staff transport. Photographs show Afrika Korps officers using them throughout the desert campaign. A surviving example at the Australian War Memorial served with the 15th Panzer Division during the Siege of Tobruk in 1941. When British and Commonwealth forces overran German positions, they captured Kübelwagens by the Hund. Many were pressed into immediate service with new owners. The Afrika Korps developed specialized variants for desert operations. The Tropenkübel featured enlarged air intakes to improve engine cooling in extreme heat. Some vehicles received balloon tires, 690 mm by 200 mm aircraft tires, that could traverse soft sand where standard tires would sink. The scale of the Desert War demands attention. Between February 1941 and May 1943, the Afrika Korps deployed thousands of Kübelwagens to North Africa. Records suggest that mechanical failures accounted for a relatively small proportion of vehicle losses. Combat destruction, capture, and abandonment during retreats claimed far more. The vehicles themselves rarely failed their crews. One Afrika Korps veteran recalled decades later that the Kübelwagen was the only vehicle you could trust in the Libyan Sand Sea. Everything else overheated, broke down, or got stuck. The little bucket car kept running when everything else stopped. Then came the Eastern Front, and the Kübelwagen faced a different kind of hell. Temperatures in the Soviet winter of 1941-42 plunged below -40 degrees Celsius. At these temperatures, engine oil becomes sludge, rubber seals crack and fail, batteries lose their charge within hours, metal becomes brittle and breaks under stress. The Wehrmachts lost thousands of vehicles to the cold before a single Soviet shell touched them. The numbers from Operation Barbarossa are staggering. By December 1941, German forces had lost tens of thousands of vehicles to mechanical failure, weather damage, and lack of spare parts. Most were trucks and staff cars with water-cooled engines. The radiators froze, cracked, and rendered the vehicles useless before enemy fire ever touched them. The Kübelwagen survived where other vehicles died. The air-cooled engine eliminated the risk of frozen coolant cracking engine blocks, a problem that destroyed thousands of water-cooled trucks. German mechanics fitted auxiliary tanks filled with highly volatile starting fuel for extreme cold conditions. The simple mechanical design meant fewer components to fail. The engine could be started in temperatures that would leave water-cooled vehicles immobilized. German mechanics learned to prime the carburetor with volatile fuel, crank the engine briefly, then switch to standard petrol once the oil warmed. The procedure was documented in field manuals and taught to drivers throughout the Eastern Front. A British Rammy officer, who captured a Kübelwagen in Sicily, wrote to the Motor magazine in June 1944. His letter describes driving the vehicle more than 5,000 kilometers across Sicily and Italy with only one breakdown, and that occurred after a crash that smashed the front suspension. The Volkswagen, he noted, can take corners a great deal faster than most staff cars, without the swinging tendency of the Jeep. This was the assessment that soldiers understood instinctively. The Kübelwagen was not a truck pretending to be a car. It was a car that happened to work in combat. German soldiers held their own opinions about the Kübelwagen, and they were not always complimentary. The lack of power was a constant complaint. Overtaking convoys on hills was nearly impossible. Climbing steep grades required passengers to dismount and push. One German veteran recalled that the Kübelwagen was perfect for everything except going uphill with 4 men and their equipment. The open-top design, practical for hot weather, became miserable in rain and snow. German troops improvised canvas covers, but water always found a way in. The bucket seats that gave the vehicle its name became uncomfortable on long journeys. The thin steel body offered no protection from cold or gunfire. Yet these same veterans acknowledged that the Kübelwagen started when other vehicles would not. It kept running when fuel was scarce. It could be repaired with minimal tools by mechanics with basic training. In a war that stretched German resources to breaking point, these qualities mattered more than comfort or raw performance. The soldiers who actually used these vehicles, German and American alike, reached similar conclusions through different experiences. The Kübelwagen was not perfect, but it worked. Chapter 5. The Trophy Everyone Wanted. The evidence of American enthusiasm begins with a remarkable document. On the 6th of June 1944, the United States Army dated Technical Manual TME 9803. The title was simply German Volkswagen. The date on the manual's cover matched the Normandy invasion, though the document was prepared in advance. The designation E9803 was significant. The standard American Jeep manual was TM9803. By assigning the German vehicle the same number, with only an E prefix for enemy, the army acknowledged that it expected troops to capture and operate Kübelwagens in sufficient numbers to require official maintenance instructions. The manual ran to dozens of pages. It included starting procedures, cold weather operation, field servicing, and troubleshooting guides. Illustrations showed proper jack placement, engine access procedures, and tire changing techniques. The Army does not publish maintenance manuals for vehicles. It does not expect soldiers to use. Think about what this document represents. On the day that approximately 156,000 Allied soldiers launched the greatest amphibious invasion in history, someone at the War Department was preparing instructions for maintaining captured German vehicles. The planning staff knew what would happen when American troops encountered Kübelwagens. They would keep them. Photographs from the European theater tell the rest of the story. At the 12th Armored Division Memorial Museum in Abilene, Texas, a photograph shows Staff Sergeants Vernon Woosey, Kenneth H. Henn, and Daniel Furden posed in a captured Kübelwagen. Woolsey was known as Montana Wildcat. H. Herndon was called Hillbilly. Furden answered to Baldy, 3 American sergeants grinning in a German vehicle somewhere in the European theater of operations. The photograph captures something essential about the American relationship with captured German equipment. These were not soldiers posing with enemy weapons to document intelligence value. They were men showing off a prize. The Kübelwagen represented victory in its most tangible form, something valuable taken from a defeated enemy. Similar photographs exist by the hundred in archives across the United States and Britain. American paratroopers crossing Carantan in a captured Kübelwagen. Soldiers of the 100th Infantry Battalion, 442nd Regimental Combat Team with a swim variant, captured during the Battle of Leghorn on July 12, 1944. American nurses riding in a captured amphibious vehicle marked with invasion stars. Medical Corps personnel transporting supplies in German bucket cars. The Kübelwagen was not just tolerated, it was celebrated. The trading economy that emerged defied official documentation, but persisted in veteran accounts and military history forums. Whether the famous exchange rates were literally accurate or simply soldier folklore, they reflected a genuine hierarchy of desirability that put German vehicles above American ones. The reasons were practical and immediate. The Kübelwagen's bucket seats, positioned within the axle lines, kept passengers secure without seatbelts, through maneuvers that would throw Jeep occupants against the bodywork. The lower center of gravity dramatically reduced rollover risk. Jeep rollover deaths, while statistically insignificant in the broader casualty figures, were alarmingly high for a non-combat cause of death. Soldiers noticed the fuel economy mattered to soldiers who had to scrage for petrol. A Kübelwagen could travel twice as far on the same amount of fuel as a Jeep. In a theater where supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers and fuel was constantly scarce, this advantage was not abstract. It was the difference between reaching your destination and walking the last 20 meters. War trophy regulations officially permitted retention of captured equipment. An August 1944 War Department document stated that such retention was considered to be for the service of the United States and not in violation of the 79th Article of War. Officers required certificates signed by superior officers. Enlisted men faced more scrutiny, but found ways around the regulations. The 28th Infantry Division provides one statistical snapshot of the trophy culture. According to some accounts, 5,000 men from that division left the European theater with as many as 20,000 war trophies between them. Most were pistols, flags, and smaller souvenirs, but vehicles were prized above all. The Luger pistol was the most famous trophy of the war, but the Kübelwagen was the most useful. A soldier could show off a Luger to his friends. He could actually drive a Kübelwagen. Veterans who survived to tell their stories often mentioned the captured vehicles with particular affection. One former sergeant from the 3rd Armored Division recalled that his unit acquired 3 Kübelwagen after the files pocket in August 1944. The company commander kept one, the first sergeant kept another. The third became shared property for anyone who needed to run errands. Nobody complained. The vehicle simply worked better for daily driving than the Jeeps. Another veteran, a mechanic with the 7th Army, remembered being ordered to service captured German vehicles alongside American equipment. The Kübelwagens were easier to work on, he noted. Everything was accessible. Everything made sense. The German engineers had thought about the poor bastard who would have to fix these things in a muddy field somewhere. Patton was not the only senior officer who noticed the problem. Across the European theatre, commanders issued similar confiscation orders, but enforcement proved difficult everywhere. How do you stop soldiers from using captured vehicles when those vehicles are often better than official issue? The answer, as it turned out, was that you could not. Soldiers continued acquiring Kübelwagens until the supply of abandoned vehicles was exhausted. Then they moved on to other German equipment, always searching for anything that might make their lives slightly easier in a war that offered few comforts. Chapter 6. The Cousins. The Kübelwagen was not the only German vehicle Americans coveted. An entire family of innovative designs emerged from the same Wolfsburg factory, each with its own admirers among Allied forces. The Schwimmwagen, officially designated Type 166, represented an even greater engineering achievement. Where the Kübelwagen could only drive on land, the Schwimmwagen could swim. A watertight hull, a retractable propeller mounted at the rear, and four-wheel drive made it the most capable amphibious car ever produced. The specifications were remarkable. The Schwimmwagen weighed 910 kilograms, slightly more than the Kübelwagen, due to the watertight hull. The engine was a larger 1,131 centimeter unit, producing 25 horsepower. On land, top speed was 80 kilometers per hour. In water, the propeller drove the vehicle at approximately 10 kilometers per hour. Production figures tell the story of rarity. German factories built 15,584 Schwimmwagen between 1942 and 1944. Production ceased when Allied bombing destroyed the manufacturing facilities. Today, only 189 survive in any condition. Just 13 exist without restoration. Auction prices regularly exceed $100,000. The American equivalent was the GPA, nicknamed the Seep for Sea Jeep. It was universally despised by the soldiers forced to use it. The Seep weighed 1,630 kilograms, nearly twice as much as the Schwimmwagen. It sat lower in the water, making it vulnerable to swamping. It was slower both on land and in water. American soldiers who encountered Schwimmwagen understood immediately why the Germans had built something better. When British forces captured the Wolfsburg factory in April 1945, they found working Schwimmwagen among the equipment. Accounts describe soldiers holding informal competitions, driving the amphibious vehicles off Wolves into the Metan Canal at 40 miles per hour with a great splash. The vehicles survived these tests, which tells you something about their construction quality. The Kettenkrad occupied a stranger place in American imagination, half motorcycle, half tank. The SDK FZ2 looked like nothing else on the battlefield. A motorcycle saddle and handlebars sat above a track chassis. The driver steered at low speeds using the handlebars, and at high speeds using braking on individual tracks. Maximum speed was 70 kilometers per hour, approximately 50 miles per hour, making it the fastest half-track vehicle of the war. Production numbers for the Kettenkrad reached 8,345 units between 1940 and 1945. The vehicle weighed 1,235 kilograms and could tow payloads exceeding 450 kilograms. German forces used Kettenkrads for tasks that would have seemed absurd to American logisticians. They towed Messerschmitt Me-262 jet aircraft to runway positions, conserving precious aviation fuel. They transported supplies through terrain impossible to wield vehicles. They served as mobile cable layers for communications units. Allied forces who captured Kettenkrads discovered a vehicle of remarkable agility and surprising durability. Captured examples were ridden by British 8th Army soldiers in North Africa and American soldiers in France. Though spare parts were nearly impossible to obtain, the track chassis required specialized maintenance that alloyed mechanics had not been trained to provide. The BMW R75 and soon DAP KS750 motorcycles, with driven sidecars, earned descriptions as the glamour machines of the Second World War. Unlike American motorcycles which drove only the rear wheel, these German designs powered both the rear wheel and the sidecar wheel through a locking differential. The result was genuine off-road capability that American Harley-Davidsons and Indians could not match. The specifications tell the story. The BMW R75 had a 745 centimeters opposed, twin engine, producing 26 horsepower. Top speed was 92 kilometers per hour. The driven side car wheel could be engaged or disengaged as needed, providing three-wheel drive for difficult terrain. Production of both models totaled approximately 35,000 units during the war, with the BMW R75 accounting for around 16,500, and the Sundap KS750 contributing roughly 18,700. They served on every front, from the Russian steppes to the North African desert. The United States Army was sufficiently impressed to order a copy. Harley-Davidson engineers, according to contemporary accounts, simply converted metric measurements to inches when designing the XA prototype. The result was a motorcycle with an air-cooled opposed twin engine, shaft drive, and hand-shifted gearbox. All features copied directly from the BMW design. Only 1,000 were built before the war ended, and the program was cancelled. Even German trucks found American admirers. The Opel Blitz used an engine so similar to General Motors' designs that Allied mechanics could repair disabled examples using Chevrolet and Bedford parts. German efficiency had inadvertently created compatibility with American supply chains. Captured Blitz trucks were repainted with Allied markings and pressed into service throughout the European theater. Chapter 7. The verdict history ignored. The official American assessment remains on the record. One U.S. evaluation dismissed the Kübelwagen as inferior in every way except in the comfort of its seating accommodations. This verdict contradicted the evidence from Aberdeen Proving Ground. It contradicted the testimony of British mechanics, who drove captured examples thousands of kilometers. It contradicted the behavior of American soldiers, who traded 2 jeeps to obtain 1 German vehicle. It contradicted the publication of Technical Manual E9803 on D-Day itself. The contradiction reveals something important about how militaries evaluate equipment. Official assessments serve institutional purposes. They justify procurement decisions. They maintain morale. They reinforce narratives of Allied superiority that were essential to the war effort. Acknowledging that the enemy had built a better light vehicle would have been politically inconvenient. The American industrial achievement was genuine and overwhelming. 640,000 jeeps compared to 50,000 Kübelwagens. 12-to-1 production advantage. Unlimited spare parts compared to chronic German shortages. The Jeep was good enough, produced in sufficient quantity and supported by logistics that German forces could only dream of matching. But soldiers are not politicians. They evaluate equipment by a single standard. Does it work? Does it keep me alive? Does it make my job easier? By these standards, the Kübelwagen earned its reputation. The air-cooled engine that eliminated radiator failures. The lightweight construction that allowed recovery from mud without mechanical assistance. The fuel economy that stretched supply lines. The comfortable seating that reduced fatigue on long movements. The smooth underbody that crossed terrain where heavier vehicles bogged down. The numbers from post-war surveys tell their own story. Veterans who had driven both vehicles were asked which they preferred. The majority chose the Kübelwagen for comfort and fuel economy. They chose the Jeep for raw capability and the knowledge that spare parts would always be available. This was the fundamental trade-off that soldiers understood and official assessments ignored. The Kübelwagen was better as a vehicle. The Jeep was better as part of a system. The post-war fate of the Kübelwagen confirms what soldiers knew. When British forces occupied the Wolfsburg factory, they initially planned to dismantle it. Germany would not be permitted to rebuild its automotive industry. The victors would ensure the defeated enemy could never again threaten their neighbors. But British officers who drove captured Kübelwagen reached different conclusions. They ordered 20,000 similar vehicles for occupation forces. By the end of 1945, the factory had produced 2,490 units under British supervision. The Volkswagen Beetle that emerged from this period became the best-selling car in history. More than 21 million were eventually produced. Ferdinand Porsche's design, condemned by British engineers as exhibiting no special brilliance, became the foundation of one of the world's great automobile manufacturers. Of the 50,435 Kübelwagen produced during the war, estimates suggest that roughly 1,000 survive today in various conditions. Perhaps 100 to 200 remain in the United States, scattered among museums and private collections. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans has one. The 12th Armored Division Memorial Museum has another. The Virginia Museum of Military Vehicles displays an example. Private collectors pay substantial sums for authentic examples with documented provenance. Most captured vehicles never returned home with their American captors. Official regulations classified large items like vehicles as property of the state rather than individual trophies. Shipping a Kübelwagen across the Atlantic required documentation that few enlisted soldiers could obtain. The paperwork was extensive, the inspections rigorous, and the shipping space limited. Many captured vehicles were simply used until they broke down, then abandoned or destroyed to prevent recapture. Others were left behind when units moved, passing to replacement troops who used them until they too moved on. The paper trail disappeared. The vehicles themselves vanished into the chaos of post-war Europe. The war correspondents who first encountered these vehicles recognized something the official reports missed: Ernie Pyle drove his captured Kübelwagen across Tunisia and understood immediately why German soldiers valued them. The vehicle was not impressive by specification. It was impressive by experience. That correspondent, Ernie Pyle, driving through the Tunisian desert in May 1943, could not know what would happen next. He could not know that within a year, the United States Army would publish a manual teaching soldiers to maintain these captured vehicles. He could not know that American generals would complain about troops stealing them. He could not know that decades later, historians would still be asking why soldiers traded 2 of their own jeeps for 1 German bucket car. But perhaps he understood in that moment what all the official reports and engineering assessments could never capture. Sometimes the best vehicle is not the most powerful one. Sometimes it is simply the one that works. Ferdinand Porsche designed a car for a regime that deserved to lose. His engineers built it in factories staffed by forced labor from across occupied Europe. Prisoners from concentration camps worked on production lines at Wolfsburg. This is one of the countless crimes of the National Socialist state. Nothing about the Kübelwagen's excellence excuses or diminishes those facts. Yet the vehicle itself, stripped of ideology, represented something genuine. A commitment to engineering elegance over brute force. A recognition that simplicity often outperforms complexity. A design philosophy that prioritized the needs of the soldiers who would actually drive these machines over the preferences of procurement officers who would never touch them. American soldiers understood this. They understood it when they captured Kübelwagen and refused to surrender them to motor pools. They understood it when they traded their own jeeps for German vehicles. They understood it when they posed for photographs, grinning in bucket cars that were supposed to be inferior in every way. The official assessment said inferior. The soldiers said something else. Ernie Pyle finished his drive through Tunisia and moved on to cover the Italian campaign. He crossed to France after D-Day and followed the American advance into Germany. He would die in April 1945, killed by Japanese machine gun fire on the island of Ishima, one of the last American correspondents killed in the Second World War. But on that day in May 1943, driving a captured Kübelwagen through the wreckage of the Afrika Korps, he was one of the first Americans to discover what thousands would later learn. Sometimes the enemy builds something better